The morning of July 7, 1944, on Saipan in the Mariana Islands, began with an unnatural silence. Private First Class Robert Hammond crouched behind his M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun, watching the tree line 400 yards to the north. The weapon sat mounted on its tripod, belt-fed ammunition snaking from a metal box beside him. 100 rounds ready, 4 more boxes. Stacked within arm's reach, 500 rounds total. The M2 weighed 84 pounds. Without its tripod, another 44 pounds. With the mount, 128 pounds of steel, designed by John Moses Browning in 1918, refined through 2 decades of testing, standardized as the M2HB Heavy Barrel in 1933, air-cooled, recoil-operated, belt-fed, capable of firing 450 to 600 rounds per minute. Each round, a 50 caliber Browning machine gun cartridge, 12.7 millimeters in diameter, 99 millimeters long. Muzzle velocity 2,910 feet per second. Muzzle energy 13,000 foot-pounds. A single round could penetrate half an inch of armor plate at 500 yards. It could punch through concrete blocks. It could disable vehicle engines. What it could do to human tissue was beyond description. Hammond had been on Saipan for 18 days. His battalion, part of the 2nd Marine Division, had landed on June 15th with 30,000 other Marines and soldiers. The Japanese defenders numbered approximately 32,000 troops commanded by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. By early July, American forces had pushed Japanese defenders into the northern third of the island. Saito's remaining forces occupied rugged terrain, caves, and fortified positions. Resupply was impossible. Reinforcement was impossible. Defeat was inevitable. But surrender was not an option the Japanese command would consider. On the evening of July 6, Saito issued final orders to his remaining forces. Tomorrow, all units would launch a coordinated assault against American positions. Every soldier, every sailor, every civilian capable of fighting would attack. The objective was not victory. Victory was impossible. The objective was to kill as many Americans as possible before dying, to make the enemy pay the maximum price, to demonstrate Japanese fighting spirit even in defeat. The attack was called Gyokusai, honorable death, mass suicide attack. In American military terminology, it would be called a banzai charge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and armed civilians assembled during the night of July 6th. They had limited ammunition. Most had rifles with fewer than 10 rounds. Some carried only grenades. Some carried only bayonets fixed to bamboo poles. They consumed whatever sake and beer remained in Japanese stores. Officers distributed final messages to be sent to families in Japan. Soldiers wrote last letters. Some tied white headbands bearing rising sun symbols. Others simply prepared to die. The American defensive line stretched across the narrowing northern section of Saipan. The 27th Infantry Division, United States Army, held the center and right. The 2nd Marine Division held the left. The line was approximately 2 miles long. Behind it sat artillery batteries, supply dumps, command posts, field hospitals. Approximately 70,000 American personnel occupied the southern 2/3 of the island. The defensive positions varied in strength. Some sectors had prepared fighting positions with interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery support, and adequate ammunition. Other sectors had hastily dug foxholes and limited support weapons. The weakest sector was held by the Army's 105th Infantry Regiment. These soldiers had been fighting for 18 days. They were exhausted. Casualties had reduced rifle companies to half strength. Ammunition was adequate but not abundant. The regiment's defensive line included gaps where dense jungle made continuous positions impossible. The Japanese attack hit this sector first. At approximately 04:15 hours on July the 7th, Japanese forces began infiltrating American lines. Small groups moved silently through gaps in the defensive positions. They cut communication wires. They attacked command posts and artillery positions with grenades and bayonets. By 04:30, the American front line was under assault across its entire length. What followed was one of the largest banzai charges in the Pacific War. 3,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and civilians attacked in waves. They shouted, "Banzai!" as they charged. They fired rifles until ammunition was exhausted, then threw grenades, then fixed bayonets, and charged with swords and improvised spears. American positions were overrun. Entire platoons were wiped out. Artillery batteries were captured and turned against American forces. The 105th Infantry Regiment's defensive line collapsed. Japanese forces poured through the breach. They advanced approximately 1,500 yards into American rear areas. They reached field hospitals and killed wounded soldiers in their beds. They attacked supply dumps and command posts. For approximately 2 hours, the outcome of the battle was uncertain. American forces could not establish a new defensive line. Japanese attackers kept coming. The breakthrough threatened to split American forces and potentially compromise the entire operation on Saipan. What stopped the Japanese advance was firepower. Not artillery, though artillery played a role. Not air support, though aircraft would arrive after dawn. What stopped the famed 3,000 attacking Japanese soldiers was concentrated automatic weapons fire from crew-served machine guns positioned in depth behind the front line. Browning M19 30 caliber water-cooled machine guns, Browning M2 50 caliber heavy machine guns, weapons designed to deliver sustained fire at rates impossible for riflemen to match. The M2 Browning was not a new weapon in July 1944. It had been in American service since 1933, but its combat application had evolved dramatically since December 1941. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft and anti-vehicle weapon, the M2 had proven equally effective against infantry. Its heavy bullet retained lethal energy at ranges where lighter weapons were ineffective. Its sustained fire capability allowed a single gun crew to engage multiple targets without pause. Its psychological impact on attacking infantry was profound. Japanese soldiers who had survived previous Banzai charges reported that American 50 caliber fire was the most terrifying weapon they faced, not because individual bullets were necessarily more lethal than rifle fire or 30 caliber machine gun fire, but because the sound, the impact, and the visible effects were overwhelming. When a 50 caliber round hit a human body, the body came apart. When 50 caliber fire swept through an advancing formation, men simply disappeared. Arms, legs, heads separated from torsos, bodies were cut in half. The visible carnage demoralized troops who might have continued advancing through rifle fire. This was not propaganda. This was physics. A 50 caliber bullet carried 13,000 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. Even at 500 yards, it retained more energy than a .30-06's rifle round at the muzzle. When that energy was transferred to human tissue, the results were catastrophic. Bones shattered, organs ruptured, limbs were severed. A hit to the torso was invariably fatal. A hit to a limb usually resulted in amputation, even if the victim survived long enough to receive medical treatment. The M2's rate of fire meant that a single gun could deliver this devastating effect repeatedly across a wide area. 450 rounds per minute meant 7.5 rounds every second. In a 10-second burst, 75 rounds. In a 1-minute sustained fire sequence, 450 rounds. Each round capable of killing or severely wounding any human being it struck. The ammunition belt fed continuously from the right or left side of the weapon. The gunner controlled fire with thumb triggers on the spade grips. Traverse and elevation were controlled manually, but the weapon's mount allowed smooth tracking. An experienced gunner could sweep fire across a target area, engaging multiple threats without pausing. The practical limitation was not the weapon's mechanical capability. It was ammunition supply and barrel heating. The M2HB designation meant heavy barrel. The barrel was designed to handle sustained fire without overheating as quickly as earlier models. In practice, this meant a trained crew could fire approximately 200 rounds before the barrel became hot enough to affect accuracy. At that point, the crew could either pause to allow cooling, or, if the tactical situation demanded, continue firing with reduced accuracy. The barrel could be changed, but this required several minutes and exposed the crew to enemy fire. Ammunition supply was the more immediate constraint. The M2 consumed ammunition at rates that required constant resupply. A standard ammunition box held 110 rounds. At 450 rounds per minute, one box lasted approximately 15 seconds of continuous fire. 4 boxes, 1 minute. 10 boxes, less than 3 minutes. Keeping an M2 supplied during sustained combat required dedicated ammunition bearers and a supply chain that could deliver hundreds of pounds of ammunition to forward positions under fire. The 50 caliber cartridge was heavy. Each round weighed approximately 4 ounces. 100 rounds weighed 25 pounds. 400 rounds, 100 pounds. 1,000 rounds, 250 pounds. Moving that weight forward during combat was physically demanding. Units that expected to employ M2s in sustained fire roles needed to pre-position ammunition or assign personnel specifically to ammunition resupply. At Saipan, on July 7th, American defensive positions behind the front line had M2 heavy machine guns positioned to provide supporting fire. These weapons were not on the immediate front line. They were positioned in depth, covering likely avenues of approach, positioned to engage targets at ranges between 200 and 1,000 yards. Their fields of fire overlapped. If Japanese forces broke through the front line, they would advance into zones covered by multiple machine guns. When the Banzai charge began, frontline units were quickly overwhelmed. Japanese forces advanced through and past frontline positions. They continued moving south, deeper into American rear areas. They were moving fast, exploiting the breakthrough, attempting to reach artillery positions and command posts before American forces could establish a new defensive line. What they encountered instead was concentrated machine gun fire from positions they had not yet reached. M2, 50 caliber guns, positioned 800, 600, 400 yards behind the front line opened fire. The Japanese advance, which had been a chaotic mass of soldiers moving rapidly forward, suddenly encountered a wall of fire. Men fell, others kept coming, more fell. The advance slowed but did not stop entirely. Japanese soldiers were committed. They had been ordered to attack until killed. Retreat was not an option. Surrender was not permitted. So they kept coming. Private First Class Hammond's position was approximately 600 yards behind the original front line. His gun covered a natural draw, a slight depression in the terrain that funneled movement. When Japanese forces broke through, some would inevitably use that draw to advance. Hammond's orders were simple. If enemy forces appeared in his field of fire, he was to engage them. Fire until they stopped coming or until he ran out of ammunition. Do not abandon the gun unless specifically ordered. At approximately 0500 hours, Hammond saw movement in the draw, dark shapes moving toward his position, not a few. Dozens, maybe more than 100. They were running, not in formation, but as individuals and small groups. They were shouting. He could hear them even at this distance. Banzai! Banzai! Hammond checked his weapon, belt seated properly, first round chambered, bolt forward, safety off. He adjusted his aim point to the center of the approaching mass, approximately 400 yards out. He pressed the thumb triggers. The M2 roared. The sound of a 50 caliber machine gun is distinctive, not the sharp crack of a rifle, not the rapid chatter of a 30 caliber machine gun. A deep, sustained hammering. Each round produced a muzzle blast powerful enough to create a visible shockwave in humid air. The noise was overwhelming at close range, physically painful without hearing protection. At a distance, it sounded like heavy machinery, a massive industrial process designed to destroy whatever stood in its path. The first burst lasted 5 seconds, approximately 37 rounds. Hammond watched the tracers arc toward the approaching Japanese soldiers. Every 5th round was a tracer, burning bright enough to track in darkness and early morning twilight. The tracers showed him where his fire was going. He adjusted slightly, walking the fire into the densest part of the approaching formation. Men fell. The effect was immediate and visible even at 400 yards. Bodies tumbled, others kept coming. Hammond fired another burst. 5 seconds, 37 more rounds. More men fell. The advance in his sector slowed. Japanese soldiers were taking cover, trying to identify the source of fire, but the draw offered limited cover. It was relatively open ground. There were scattered rocks and shallow depressions, but nothing that could stop a 50 caliber round. Hammond fired continuously, short bursts of 3 to 5 seconds, pausing only long enough to adjust his aim. The gun remained steady on its tripod. The recoil, absorbed by the weapon's recoil mechanism, and the mass of the mount was manageable. He swept fire back and forth across the draw, engaging any target he could see. Japanese soldiers tried to advance. They ran forward between bursts. Some made it 20 or 30 yards before being hit. Others were hit immediately. The 50 caliber rounds did not require precise hits to be effective. A round that hit a man's leg would sever the leg. A round that hit an arm would sever the arm. A round that struck the torso anywhere would kill instantly. There were no minor wounds from 50 caliber fire. After approximately 90 seconds, Hammond's first ammunition box was empty. 110 rounds expended. He paused, lifted the empty belt, seated a new belt from the second box, chambered the first round, resumed firing. The pause lasted perhaps 5 seconds. During that 5 seconds, Japanese soldiers surged forward. When Hammond resumed fire, they were closer, maybe 350 yards now. He fired longer bursts. 7 seconds, 10 seconds, the barrel was heating. He could see heat waves rising from it, but the Japanese were still coming. Not as many now, maybe half the original number, but still coming, still shouting, still attacking. Private Robert Turner, positioned in a foxhole 30 yards to Hammond's right, fired his M1 Garand rifle as fast as he could pull the trigger. 8 rounds, reload 8 more rounds. He was hitting targets. He could see men fall, but there were too many. For every one he killed, 3 more kept coming. His rifle was not enough. Even firing rapidly, he could only engage 1 target at a time. Hammond's M2 engaged all of them simultaneously. The machine gun swept back and forth, hosing the draw with fire. Japanese soldiers were dying faster than they could advance. Bodies were piling up. Some Japanese used the bodies as cover, crouching behind dead comrades, waiting for a pause in fire to rush forward. Hammond did not give them a pause. He fired until his second box was empty, switched to his third box, continued firing. By 0505, approximately 10 minutes after the attack began in Hammond's sector, the Japanese advance in the draw had stopped, not because the attackers had withdrawn, because there were no attackers left standing. The draw was filled with bodies. Japanese soldiers who had been running forward were now lying still. Some moved slightly, wounded, unable to continue. Most did not move at all. Hammond had fired approximately 300 rounds in 10 minutes. His barrel was extremely hot. The gun's barrel shroud glowed faintly in the dim light. He could smell the heated metal. He paused, watching for additional targets. His hands were shaking from adrenaline. His ears rang from the noise. But the gun was still functional. If more targets appeared, he could engage them. Across the broader battlefield, similar engagements were occurring. Other M2 positions were firing at other groups of Japanese attackers. The sound of 50 caliber fire was continuous across the American rear area. The deep hammering merged into a sustained roar that lasted for approximately 30 minutes. Japanese forces continued attacking. American machine gunners continued firing. The Japanese took horrific casualties, but could not break through the defensive positions anchored by crew-served weapons. By 0600 hours, the intensity of the attack had diminished. Japanese forces were either dead, wounded, or too disorganized to continue coordinated attacks. Small groups still infiltrated American lines throughout the morning, but the mass assault had been broken. The final count of Japanese casualties from the July 7th Banzai charge would exceed 4,000 killed. American casualties exceeded 1,000, including approximately 650 killed. The majority of American casualties occurred in the initial breakthrough when frontline units were overrun. Once machine gun positions in depth engaged the attackers, the casualty ratio shifted dramatically in favor of American forces. The M2 Browning had not been designed for this role. It had been designed to shoot down aircraft and disable armored vehicles. But on Saipan, as in countless other engagements across the Pacific, it proved devastatingly effective against massed infantry. The weapon's combination of range, stopping power, and sustained fire capability made it ideal for defensive combat against numerically superior forces, employing human wave tactic. The development of the M2 Browning began in 1918, near the end of World War I. General John J. Pershing, commanding American Expeditionary Forces in France, observed the effectiveness of large-caliber machine guns against aircraft and light armor. He requested development of an American heavy machine gun firing a cartridge larger than the standard .30-06. Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia responded by scaling up the .30-06 cartridge to create a new round, 12.7 millimeters in diameter, 99 millimeters long. The cartridge was designated 50 caliber Browning machine gun, or 50 BMG. It fired a bullet weighing approximately 700 grains at a muzzle velocity approaching 3,000 feet per second. The energy delivered was approximately 3 times that of the .30-06. John Moses Browning, already famous for designing the M1917 water-cooled machine gun and the Browning automatic rifle, scaled up his M1917 design to chamber the new 50 caliber cartridge. The first prototype was completed in 1918. Testing continued through 1919 and 1920. The initial design was water-cooled, similar to the M1917 30 caliber. It weighed over 100 pounds without the water jacket filled. The water-cooled Model 1921 entered service in limited numbers during the 1920s. It was effective but extremely heavy. Moving it required multiple soldiers. Setting it up took time. The water cooling system added complexity and weight. Military planners wanted something lighter and simpler. In 1933, Browning and Colt engineers developed an air-cooled version. The water jacket was eliminated. The barrel was made heavier to absorb and dissipate heat through air cooling. This version was designated M2 Heavy Barrel, or M2HB. Total weight dropped to 84 pounds for the gun itself, plus 44 pounds for the tripod mount. Still heavy, but manageable for a crew of 3 or 4 soldiers. The M2HB could fire 450 to 600 rounds per minute, depending on how the weapon was adjusted. It used a short recoil operating system. When fired, the barrel and bolt recoiled together for approximately 1 inch. Then the bolt unlocked and continued rearward while the barrel stopped. The bolt extracted the spent cartridge, compressed a recoil spring, then was driven forward by the spring. On the way forward, it stripped a new cartridge from the belt, chambered it, locked into the barrel extension, and the gun was ready to fire again. This cycle repeated automatically as long as the trigger was pressed and ammunition was available. The weapon could be adjusted for different rates of fire by changing the oil buffer settings. A slower rate of fire, around 450 rounds per minute, allowed more precise fire and reduced barrel heating. A faster rate, around 600 rounds per minute, delivered more suppressive fire but heated the barrel more rapidly. Most units in combat adjusted their guns for rates between 500 and 550 rounds per minute, balancing suppression and barrel life. Ammunition was fed from the right or left side via disintegrating metal link belts. Each cartridge was held in a metal link. As the bolt moved forward, it stripped the cartridge from the link. The empty link was ejected to the side. This system allowed continuous feeding. Belts could be joined together to create longer continuous belts, or ammunition could be fed from individual boxes holding 110 rounds each. The M2HB entered production in 1933. Initial production was slow. The weapon was expensive to manufacture. Each gun required extensive machining of heavy steel parts to tight tolerances. The recoil mechanism was complex. Early production guns cost approximately $750 each, equivalent to several months of a worker's salary at the time. But the weapon worked. It was reliable, it was accurate, it was powerful. And as American military forces expanded in the late 1930s, production increased. By December 1941, when the United States entered World War II, several thousand M2HB machine guns were in service. By 1945, production would exceed 350,000 guns. The M2 was initially deployed as an anti-aircraft weapon. It was mounted on ships, on vehicles, on ground mounts around airfields and important installations. The assumption was that its primary target would be low-flying aircraft. In practice, Opportunities to engage aircraft with ground-mounted 50 caliber guns were rare. Aircraft flew too fast and too high for manually aimed machine guns to be consistently effective. Radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery and fighter aircraft were far more effective at shooting down enemy planes, but the M2 found other uses. In North Africa, in 1942 and 43, American forces mounted M2s on jeeps and half-tracks for convoy escort and patrol work. The guns were effective against light armored vehicles, trucks, and buildings. German forces quickly learned to respect American 50 caliber fire. A burst from an M2 could disable a truck, destroy a machine gun position, or kill soldiers behind cover that would stop rifle fire. In the Pacific, the M2 proved valuable in similar roles, but the weapon's most significant tactical impact came from its employment against infantry, particularly against Japanese banzai charges and infiltration tactics. Japanese military doctrine emphasized offensive spirit and close combat. Infantry attacks often came in waves, with soldiers advancing rapidly to close with American positions before superior American firepower could be fully employed. This tactic was effective against rifle-armed infantry who needed time to aim and fire at individual targets. It was far less effective against machine guns that could sweep fire across entire formations. The M2, with its long range and devastating terminal effects, was particularly effective at breaking up attacks before they could close to bayonet range. Japanese soldiers advancing across open ground at 400 yards were well within effective range of the M2. The gun could engage them continuously as they approached, inflicting casualties throughout their advance. By the time survivors reached 100 yards, their formation had usually been disrupted and their numbers reduced. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological impact was significant. Japanese soldiers who survived attacks against positions defended by M2 heavy machine guns reported that the weapon was terrifying. The sound alone was demoralizing. The visible effects, seeing comrades literally torn apart by 50 caliber fire, broke the will of even highly motivated troops. After several experiences with M2 fire, Japanese units became reluctant to launch frontal attacks against positions known to have 50 caliber guns. American commanders noticed this and began using M2s as anchors for defensive positions. If a sector had an M2 positioned to cover likely avenues of approach, that sector was less likely to be attacked. If it was attacked, the attack was more likely to fail. The presence of the weapon provided defensive strength disproportionate to its numbers. On Saipan, in July 1944, approximately 40 M2 heavy machine guns were positioned in the defensive sector hit by the banzai charge. Not all 40 were engaged simultaneously. The attack came in waves and struck different parts of the line at different times. But over the course of the battle, most of those guns fired. Some fired hundreds of rounds, some fired thousands. Exact counts were not kept during the battle, but post-battle ammunition expenditure reports indicated that M2s in the engaged sector fired approximately 25,000 rounds. During the night and morning of July 7th, 25,000 50 caliber rounds, each weighing 4 ounces, total weight 6,250 pounds, more than 3 tons of projectiles fired at attacking Japanese forces. The logistical effort required to supply that much ammunition forward during an ongoing battle was substantial. Ammunition trucks moved forward under fire. Working parties carried ammunition from trucks to gun positions. Gunners and ammunition bearers worked continuously to keep weapons supplied. The effectiveness of this expenditure was documented in the casualty count. More than 4,000 Japanese soldiers were killed during the banzai charge. Not all were killed by M2 fire. Rifles, 30 caliber machine guns, artillery and hand grenades all contributed. But post-battle analysis indicated that crew-served machine guns, particularly the M2, accounted for the majority of casualties. Japanese bodies recovered from areas covered by M2 fire showed distinctive wound patterns, massive trauma, limbs severed, torsos bisected, wounds that were immediately fatal. The tactical lessons from Saipan reinforced what American forces had learned throughout the Pacific campaign. The M2 heavy machine gun was the single most effective weapon for stopping infantry attacks. One M2, with adequate ammunition and a trained crew, could hold a defensive sector that might otherwise require a full platoon of riflemen. The weapon's psychological impact was as important as its physical effects. Enemy forces learned to avoid areas covered by M2 fire. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien commanded the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. His battalion held part of the sector hit hardest by the Banzai charge. In the initial assault, Japanese forces overran his forward positions and pushed deep into his battalion area. O'Brien organized a fighting retreat, attempting to establish successive defensive lines to slow the Japanese advance. At approximately 05:15 hours, O'Brien's command post came under direct attack. Japanese soldiers were within 50 yards, charging with bayonets and swords. O'Brien fired his 2 pistols until empty. He was wounded in the shoulder. Despite the wound, he moved to a jeep-mounted M2 50 caliber machine gun. The weapon was positioned to provide security for the command post, but had not yet been engaged. O'Brien manned the gun himself. He traversed the weapon toward the approaching Japanese soldiers and opened fire. The range was extremely close, less than 50 yards. The effect of 50 caliber fire at that range was catastrophic. Japanese soldiers were literally blown apart. Bodies were torn to pieces. The attack stalled as survivors dove for cover. O'Brien continued firing, sweeping the M2 back and forth across the area in front of his position. He was exposed. Standing behind the gun, wounded and bleeding, Japanese soldiers fired at him. He ignored the fire and continued shooting. He emptied one ammunition box, loaded another, continued firing. His sustained fire held the Japanese back long enough for other American soldiers to organize a defense. When O'Brien's ammunition was exhausted, Japanese forces rushed his position. He was killed in the final assault. When American forces retook the area later that morning, they found O'Brien's body beside his gun. Approximately 30 Japanese soldiers lay dead in the immediate area around the M2 position. All had been killed by 50 caliber fire. O'Brien was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on July 7, 1944. His citation specifically noted his use of the 50 caliber machine gun to cover the withdrawal of his men. The citation stated that he continued firing despite severe wounds until his ammunition was exhausted and he was overwhelmed by enemy forces. O'Brien's stand represented the M2's capabilities when employed by a determined operator. 30 Japanese soldiers killed by one man, firing one gun in approximately 15 minutes. The weapon had given O'Brien the firepower of an entire platoon. Even when wounded and surrounded, he had been able to inflict casualties sufficient to slow the enemy advance and allow his unit to regroup. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the M2 Browning had become synonymous with American firepower. Soldiers and Marines trusted it completely. They knew it would function when needed. They knew it would deliver devastating fire against any target. They knew it gave them advantages enemy forces could not match. The weapon's reputation extended beyond World War II. During the Korean War from 1950 to 53, M2s proved equally effective against Chinese and North Korean forces. During the Vietnam War, M2s provided fire support and convoy security. In subsequent conflicts through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the M2 remained in American service, still performing the same missions it had performed in 1944. The remarkable longevity of the M2 design speaks to its fundamental soundness. John Browning developed the basic operating system in 1918. Engineers refined it through the 1920s and early 1930s. The M2HB configuration, adopted in 1933, remained essentially unchanged for more than 70 years. Modern M2A1 variants incorporate minor improvements like quick-change barrels and improved mounting systems, but the core weapon is the same design that saw combat on Saipan. This longevity is almost unique among military weapons. Most designs become obsolete within a generation as technology advances and tactical requirements change. The M2 has served continuously for more than 90 years across multiple wars, countless conflicts, and dramatic changes in military technology and doctrine, the weapon remains effective because the fundamental requirements it addresses have not changed. Infantry still needs weapons that can deliver sustained, accurate, long-range fire against a variety of targets. The M2 still does this better than most alternatives. The story of Private First Class Hammond and the morning of July 7, 1944, represents thousands of similar stories across the Pacific War, individual soldiers manning crew-served weapons, holding positions against numerically superior forces, achieving results through firepower rather than numbers. These stories are rarely documented in detail. Official histories record unit actions and strategic outcomes. Individual contributions are lost unless they result in medals or other recognition. Most M2 gunners in World War II never received individual recognition. They did their jobs, survived, or died, and went home, or were buried in military cemeteries across the Pacific. Their names appear on unit rosters and casualty lists, but not in detailed historical accounts. Yet their collective contribution was essential to American victory. They provided the firepower that stopped Japanese attacks. They held defensive positions that anchored entire battle lines. They supported offensive operations that captured islands and advanced toward Japan. The M2 Browning gave these soldiers capabilities that previous generations could not have imagined. A single soldier with an M2 and adequate ammunition could engage and defeat forces that would have overwhelmed an entire company in earlier wars. This was not because American soldiers were individually superior. It was because they had better tools. The M2 was one of those tools, perhaps the most important crew-served weapon in the American infantry arsenal. The broader lesson from the M2's history is about the relationship between technology, training, and tactical effectiveness. Technology alone is not sufficient. The M2 was a sophisticated weapon that required extensive training to employ effectively. Training alone is not sufficient. Well-trained soldiers with inferior weapons will lose to adequately trained soldiers with superior weapons. The combination of good technology and good training creates military effectiveness. American forces in World War II had both. They had weapons like the M2 that were as good or better than anything enemy forces fielded. They had training programs that prepared soldiers to use those weapons effectively. They had logistic systems that kept weapons supplied with ammunition and maintained in working condition. They had tactical doctrine that employed weapons in ways that maximized their effectiveness. The result was military forces that could consistently defeat larger enemy forces in direct combat. American units were not always larger than the enemy units they faced. American soldiers were not superhuman, but American units had firepower advantages that translated into tactical victories. The M2 was part of that advantage, not the only part, but an important part. When we examine specific engagements like the Saipan Banzai charge, we see this advantage in action. Japanese forces attacked with determination, courage, and numerical superiority in the initial assault. They broke through American front lines and advanced deep into rear areas. Under earlier technological conditions, such an attack might have succeeded, but in 1944, American forces had M2 machine guns positioned in depth. Those guns delivered fire that stopped the attack and killed thousands of Japanese soldiers. The mathematics of the engagement are instructive. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers attacked. Approximately 4,000 were killed, including reinforcements who joined the attack during the night. American defensive forces numbered approximately 8,000 in the engaged sector, but only a fraction were directly engaged in combat. Most were support personnel, artillery crews, or reserves. The actual fighting was done by perhaps 2,000 American combat troops armed with rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The casualty ratio heavily favored American forces. For every American soldier killed, multiple Japanese soldiers died. This ratio was not because American soldiers were better fighters in some inherent sense. It was because American firepower was overwhelming. The M2's 30 caliber machine guns, artillery, and mortars delivered fire that Japanese forces could not match. They had courage and determination. They did not have equivalent weapons. This firepower disparity characterized the entire Pacific War. In almost every engagement, American forces could bring more firepower to bear than Japanese forces. Sometimes this came from naval gunfire support, sometimes from artillery, sometimes from airstrikes, but even in direct infantry combat, without external support, American units had firepower advantages. The M2 was part of that advantage. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.